Welcome. This is In the Evening with Ike Kruchler. Did you ever hear about a man called Francis Mill? He was a bit of a big deal in the late 70s, early 80s. They called him the Dirty Drifter, which is a moniker he took to pretty fondly, but probably shouldn't have. Don't get the wrong idea about it. No, Francis wasn't another one of the broken, disturbed, or morbidly perverse characters I've told you about before. For Francis, the dirty of Dirty Drifter meant just that. And by that I mean the man was perpetually and unfailingly encrusted in an epidermal layer of grease and grime and topsoil. How he managed it continues to be a point of contention among the lucky few who once knew him, shook his hand, and presumably haven't been rid of the smell of him since. Some said he slept in it. Some say he bathed in it. Some say he considered the muck and filth and feculence found on the forest floor to be his own personal brand of perfume, a trademark he'd adopted. Like I said, there were different schools of thought on the matter. I guess nobody ever thought to ask him why he was so damn dirty all the time, but Francis was, indeed, dirty and a drifter. But it wasn't always that way. They say he grew up in the sheltered suburbs that lay in the shadow of the Motor City itself, before going to see some western about a man who rolls into town like a tumbleweed, then rolls on back out just the same, like all of those movies, and decided that that was the life for him. So he pissed away all of his money and set about hoofing it in no particular direction till the road ran out. No maps, no compass, no tent. The man simply pulled a Blanche Dubois and relied, from there on out, on the kindness of strangers. Sometimes he had a bed to sleep in, a hot meal, a toothbrush, toilet paper. Sometimes he wasn't afforded such luxuries. But Francis Mill never once complained. He never showed anyone anything but a benevolent and benign disposition. He never once forgot that he was in this singularly unglamorous life by choice, kept in mind at all times that any adversity or mishappery that befell him was, ultimately, his own fault. Consequently, for a man who must have bore the scent of 1,000 shitting, rotting, wet dogs, he garnered an undeniably impressive amount of goodwill and friendliness directed towards him from seemingly all angles. For a while there, everybody liked the Dirty Drifter. The story I'm about to tell you took place in June sometime in the early 80s. I can't tell you where. He came into town hitching down the highway and did pretty well for himself there, all things considered. He found himself some grub from a local eatery, occupied himself by making friendly with some locals, so maybe he washed his face, I don't know. He even managed to score himself a hammock, borrowed from somebody's sympathetic old grandmother who thought he'd have more use for it during the cold, lonely night than she would. So, come sundown, he made his way into the woods, to string it up high between two trees. He used to like camping out in the woods. Said it made him feel like a wild animal, completely and uncompromisingly free. I only wonder how something bad never happened to the man until that day. What I'm going to pull from a little later is a written account of the event allegedly from the Dirty Drifter himself. I say allegedly because it was in true Francis Dirty Drifter Mill fashion, written on a stack of paper towels taken from one of those dispensers they put on diner tables. More on that later. It also contains numerous spelling and grammar errors, though I will say this shouldn't come as a surprise. The document begins with a sparse description of his journey into town. I imagine for a fellow such as Mill, life on the road can get formulaic. I myself have seen a lot of highways. They tend not to deviate too far from a generic design. Straight road, cut down the middle, stretching out for miles under the trundling wheels of the impatient and, often, the impolite. Something stood out for Francis on this particular highway, though. If you travel far enough down any major highway, sooner or later you'll come to a roadside memorial. It can be sobering to see one of these. A little bitty cross, an old-school photo plastic wrapped to a telephone pole, a bicycle painted white, left there indefinitely. A little reminder of the delicacy of the whole situation. A lifetime's worth of grief simmered down and distilled to a fistful of funny-colored flowers. A ratty old teddy bear. The kind of thing that catches your eye for a second, but soon fades into the background. A little spot of color in your rearview mirror, shrinking away into the vanishing point. Sorry, I'm waxing poetic again. Stop me next time. Anyway, the point is, to a man like Francis Mill, a man who's probably spent more time on the highway than he has off, a roadside memorial is downright commonplace, hardly worth draining a diner of disposable hand towels to document. But that's the thing. They just kept coming, one after another. According to this impromptu diary, before he reached town, Francis Mill counted 16 roadside memorials lining the highway. 16 bunches of old dead flowers, 16 ancient teddy bears. Now, isn't that peculiar? Francis thought so too. But Francis had thought of a lot of things over the years, and most of them didn't amount to much. When he arrived in town, I doubt he even remembered he saw anything unusual. So, as previously stated, he got himself acquainted, made a few good first impressions despite the dirt, and hunkered down for a night in the forest. He set up camp by the river, stating that the sound of the running water helped him sleep. I bet he kicked himself for thinking that, because just after 2 a.m. he got his fair share of running water. He describes being woken up by a sudden downpour. Not a particularly dramatic one, but when you're sleeping out in a hammock in the middle of the woods, it's the sort of thing that'll interrupt your shut-eye. To recount what happened next, in order to preserve Francis Mill's point of view, if indeed it was his point of view, and not the sort of flight of fancy one would expect from a man whose pastimes include waiting and walking, I will read a transcript of the napkins. I didn't get back to sleep because the rain kept me cold and kept filling the hammock, but I was too tired to take it down or find shelter. I lay there for I think an hour, maybe more. That's when I saw a line of people in gray clothes walk past me and down the trail. They didn't talk, and all looked like they knew where they were going. There were so many of them that I thought one would notice me. But they didn't. It was too dark. When they had all passed, I got out of the hammock as slow and careful as I could, then went down the trail to see where they were going. Now, if you're beginning to feel the slightest bit worried about the crowd dear old Francis had stumbled upon, you are not alone. After all, what reasonable reason could be given for a sizable group of townsfolk to go hushedly bushwhacking on a dark and stormy night so close to the witching hour? If that wasn't enough, unbeknownst to Francis, the poor, dumb bastard had camped out on summer solstice. Francis walked a while longer, until he met a little truss bridge cut across the river. He was now soaked to the bone, underslept, but I doubt he was in any danger of falling asleep. What he saw there on that bridge and how he described it has been the subject of much speculation and disagreement. But here's what we do know. He was indeed out in the woods, or at least the old woman's sleeping bag was. It was indeed raining. There was a bridge, and, some way or another, a man was going to die very soon. Here's what Francis said. They were all there, about 100 people. They were piled up on either side of the bridge with a gap in the middle. I was over by the trees on the riverside. I was really scared. After a while, they all put their heads down and somebody brought out a duffel bag and laid it out in the middle of the bridge. When they set it down, it jerked back and then started moving around. Then somebody took a good long rope and threw the end of it over the metal bar at the top of the bridge, and then tied the end in a loop. They took a guy out of the duffel bag, and I couldn't see him because I was too far away. But I think he had long black hair, a beard, and a red cloth tied around his mouth so he couldn't talk. He was squirming and he wouldn't stop moving, but people were holding him down, and one of them tied the rope around his neck. And they started pulling it from the other end, and he started getting pulled up until he was hanging and bucking around like a fish. He kept moving, and they kept pulling him higher, and it kept going on until he stopped moving and his legs and arms went all straight and kept jerking upwards like he was trying to jump out of the rope. until he went all stiff and shaky, and stayed like that. And everyone was looking up at him. And then he went slack, and he wet himself, and he was dead. And they let him down, and they all crowded around. Someone went in with some kind of tool, I don't know what it was, but everyone went up and started touching him and staying around him, and when they went back they had blood on them. And they took off their clothes and began to dance and holler and make love to each other in the blood. I ran for my life even though I had nowhere to go. According to Francis, he then collapsed out of exhaustion in an alley behind a storefront in town. He climbed into a dumpster out of some misguided fear that he had been seen and was now being pursued. No one was looking for him, and no one found him until he woke up in the afternoon the next day. How he managed to sleep, I'll never know. When he awoke, he didn't dilly-dally. He didn't indulge himself in the pleasantries and conversation he'd had the day before. He didn't eat. He didn't even give the old lady her hammock back. He simply wrote down his accounts so no details could leave his memory, and slipped out of town. He went to the highway, hoping to catch a ride as soon as possible. But on his way there, he saw one last surprise this little place had for him. A roadside memorial, like all the others, only this one had fresh flowers. He got a closer look. It was dedicated to a man called Tate Malone. And you want to know the damnedest thing? That little white cross with the man's name on it was surrounded by cards. Thank you cards. That's something to wrap your head around. Thank you cards. As if his death was some sort of favor that a lot of people felt indebted to. After a while, Francis caught a ride. He hitchhiked as far away from that little town as he could and never went back. He thought over what he'd seen, or what he thought he'd seen, again and again, considering how best to deal with the information he'd been burdened with. He decided to hand his story to the police a couple towns over, who promptly disregarded it. According to the local authorities and a reputable coroner's report, Tate Malone had been killed in a rather unfortunate hit-and-run car accident. Decapitated. And even if those seasoned officers of the law did see it fit that they put their trust in a self-proclaimed dirty drifter and his paranoid napkin-bound 95 Theses, any evidence they could have inspected was long gone. Tate Malone had since been cremated. And I doubt anyone would get too far anyway investigating whether, instead of falling victim to one of the most common causes of death for someone of his age, he was, in fact, the victim of some bizarre, super-secret, small-town human sacrifice cult. So, forgotten, defeated, and somehow even more humiliated than he'd made himself his entire life prior, Francis Mill found himself with not much else to do but to keep on keeping on. He drifted away, and I must admit I personally haven't been able to find any record of him for quite some time. Maybe what he saw that night served as just the kind of kick in the pants that'd launch a man like that into more of a regular, solitary life. The kind where you don't put so much faith in strangers and their small-town hospitality. Who knows? And the town? It still operates as was, and as countless other small towns across the nation have and will continue to indefinitely. Humbly. Sleepily. But perhaps with more going on behind closed doors and handcrafted welcome mats as would appear at first glance. One last thing, though. At the time of his death, Tate Malone was a sandy brown-haired man. But he did have a beard. Maybe I'm just pissing in the wind.